I was a peculiar teenager, to say the least. Some people collected rare coins, others spent hours perfecting their guitar solos in garage bands. Me? My hobby was wandering through pitch-black, desolate forest trails in the dead of night. The woods always held a particular fascination, like a living, breathing labyrinth that whispered its secrets only in the dark. Looking back, I'm not sure if it was bravery, recklessness, or plain teenage insanity that led me there. But my logic was simple. Face your fears, become invincible. I craved that pulse-pounding, hair-raising adrenaline rush that came with creeping into places most people would steer clear of after sunset. There was a perverse thrill in walking the narrow paths lined with ancient, gnarled trees, branches that twisted overhead like skeletal hands. I would set out without a flashlight, my eyes straining to adjust to the inky darkness. Every sound seemed amplified, the crack of a twig underfoot, the rustle of unseen creatures skittering through underbrush. Shadows morphed into shapes that defied reason, and the silence was so loud it could swallow you whole. This night, though, was different. I remember how thick the air felt, as if the entire forest held its breath in anticipation. The moon was nowhere to be seen, and the usual shimmering starlight seemed swallowed by a black void. The path before me dissolved into a dark mystery, each step uncertain, each moment a test of my resolve. I was well beyond the threshold where turning back felt like an option. The woods had already swallowed me, and I felt like an intruder trespassing in a world that wasn't mine. I pressed on, each breath sounding louder in the silence, each heartbeat drumming a rhythm in my ears. Then suddenly I sensed it, a prickle at the back of my neck, a faint static-like charge in the air, the unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. I halted, straining to listen, but the forest was silent, holding secrets in the cradle of its shadows. I told myself it was paranoia, an overactive imagination. Maybe a deer or a fox was watching from a distance, curious about the stupid teenager tempting fate. I started walking again, trying to calm my mind, when it happened. I saw him, or rather, I collided with him. One moment, the path was empty, a corridor of endless darkness. The next, he was there, looming out of the shadows, a hulking shape that seemed to materialize inches from my face. His face was obscured, just a pale blotch in the blackness, but his eyes, those I saw, two orbs glinting like a predator's gaze catching moonlight. A scream ripped from my throat, raw and instinctive, the kind of sound that bubbles up when you feel your entire life may be about to end. Panic ignited my veins like wildfire. My legs moved before my brain could catch up, propelling me backward, away from him. I turned and sprinted into the dark, my sneakers pounding against the forest floor. The branches clawed at me, slashing my skin, but I didn't dare slow down. Then, to my absolute horror, I heard the sound that every bone in my body prayed I wouldn't. Footsteps. Heavy, relentless footsteps crashing through the undergrowth behind me. He was chasing me. My lungs burned as I tore through the forest, the world around me a blur of shadows and fear. The footsteps grew louder, then softer, then louder again. My brain played cruel tricks, convincing me that he was gaining on me, that I could feel his breath hot on the back of my neck. I ran like a hunted animal, driven by sheer, blind panic, the primal instinct to survive. At some point, my body screamed for oxygen, for rest, but I didn't dare stop. The thought of slowing down was like inviting death to reach out and take me. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my knees buckling but refusing to fall. I ran and ran, a human version of Forrest Gump, running because the only other choice was to face whatever nightmare was in pursuit. And then, as suddenly as it started, the footsteps began to fade. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Instead, I kept going, my vision blurring with tears, muscles quaking with exhaustion. Finally, after what felt like hours but could have been mere minutes, I burst out of the woods and collapsed onto the pavement of a sleepy suburban street. Streetlights glowed like salvation, spilling warm pools of light that banished the darkness clinging to my soul. I choked back sobs, gulping air in ragged gasps, too terrified to even turn and check if he was still there. Eventually, my heart began to slow, and the reality of what had just happened sank in like icy needles. I had no explanation, no sense of closure. The only thing I knew was that I would never set foot in those woods at night again. The image of his eyes, cold and unreadable, haunted me. They lingered in my nightmares for years, and I often wondered who or what he was. A forest ranger, perhaps? Maybe just some man who'd stumbled across a foolish teenager wandering where he shouldn't have. Or was it something darker, something that had slipped through the veil of the ordinary world to hunt me down? When you're young, your imagination runs wild, and I convinced myself it was a serial killer. The kind that you hear about on the news, hiding in the shadows, waiting for a victim. Maybe he really was, or maybe he was just as terrified as I was, thinking he'd encountered a ghost in the form of a screaming teenager. I'll never know, and perhaps that's the scariest part, the ambiguity, the not knowing. I still think about that night sometimes, in the hours before dawn when the world is dark and silent, when shadows stretch long and memories whisper from the past. I remember the footsteps, the eyes, the suffocating darkness. And even now, all these years later, my heart races just thinking about it. It's a story that starts with foolish teenage bravado and ends in the kind of terror that leaves a permanent scar on your soul. The woods no longer hold their allure, and the thrill I once sought has been replaced by something else. Something deeper, more lasting. Fear. 15 years ago, we went for a drive that I'll never forget, a night that has since carved itself into the deepest parts of my memory. My parents, my younger brother, and I were in the family car, a somewhat battered Nissan Primera. We'd spent the day exploring the countryside, checking out a house far beyond the city limits, a place my parents had considered buying. By the time we wrapped up our little adventure, the sun had long disappeared, leaving behind a cold darkness that made everything feel more unsettling. There was no GPS back then, no comforting blue dot to guide us out of the sprawling countryside and back to civilization. We were, in every sense, completely and utterly lost. Our headlights cut a path through the surrounding blackness, illuminating a world that felt increasingly alien. The road was an endless, winding expanse of dirt, lined with dead trees that loomed like twisted sentinels and tall, wild grass that shivered in the breeze. The atmosphere had taken on an eerie quality, a tension you could almost taste in the air. The car's engine hummed steadily, but even that sound seemed swallowed by the vast, unsettling emptiness. My dad kept a nervous grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. We passed countless deserted crossroads, each one looking more desolate than the last. There was no logic to where we were going. It felt as if we were trapped in some cruel labyrinth. Every time we hoped we were getting closer to the highway, we found ourselves deeper in the maze, surrounded by dark, whispering fields. Then, just as we approached yet another empty intersection, something strange came into view. A shape was lying in the middle of the road, illuminated by our car's high beams. It was a baby carriage, a beat-up, rusted, and overturned baby carriage. My dad slowed down, the tires crunching on the gravel, and my mom's voice sliced through the heavy silence. "Oh my God! Stop! There's a baby!" Her voice trembled with a mix of horror and urgency. As we drew closer, the faintest sound reached us, muffled at first but unmistakable. A baby was crying. The wail was desperate, chilling, the kind of sound that clings to your nerves like icy fingers. My mom's hand went for the door handle, her instincts flaring to life. "My God! The baby! Get the baby!" she screamed, the fear in her voice escalating into a frantic pitch. She started to open her door, her motherly instinct overpowering any logical thought. My dad, however, didn't hesitate. With a sudden, gut-wrenching burst of adrenaline, he slammed the gear into drive and stomped on the gas. The Nissan lurched forward, tires screeching and kicking up gravel. The car fishtailed for a moment, and we all jolted in our seats, but my dad had only one thing on his mind: getting us the hell out of there. My mom screamed in disbelief, her door still half open, and tears streamed down her face. The baby's cries still echoed behind us, though they were now swallowed by the growing distance and the roar of our accelerating engine. My brother and I twisted around in our seats, compelled by the horror and chaos, and that's when we saw them. Figures, 4 of them, erupted from the tall grass lining the road. They moved fast, their shapes distorted in the red glow of our tail lights. Men with wild eyes, their faces obscured by shadows, lunged out of the darkness clutching planks of wood, baseball bats, and makeshift weapons. They looked like hunters who had just missed their prey. My heart stopped as I watched them chase the car for a few steps, weapons raised, before we finally left them behind in the dust. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. My mom was still sobbing, her voice trembling with shock and fear. My dad's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. My brother and I sat frozen, our minds racing to process what had just happened. A beat-up baby carriage, the cries of a phantom infant, and men lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. After what seemed like hours, we finally stumbled onto a highway, the bright headlights of passing cars like beacons guiding us back to the realm of the living. We stopped at the first gas station we saw, the fluorescent lights shining down like a promise of safety. My dad stumbled out of the car, visibly shaken, and approached the attendant. He recounted what had happened, his voice low but tight with residual terror. The gas station attendant barely flinched, as if he'd heard it all before. "Oh yeah," he said with an almost casual nonchalance. "The gypsies. Those guys have been pulling that trick around here for ages. They plant a baby doll in an old carriage, make it cry somehow. People stop, thinking it's a real baby, and then they jump out and rob you blind. Take your car, your money, whatever they can get." My dad stood there, stunned into silence. We'd almost fallen into their trap. Almost. The thought made my skin crawl, the reality that our lives could have taken a much darker turn that night. The idea that shadows were alive with more than just tricks of the light. We never drove back to that area again. The memory of that night, of the overturned baby carriage and those men waiting in the tall grass, has haunted me ever since. Sometimes I think about what could have happened if my dad had hesitated even for a second. If he'd given in to the same instinct that had made my mom reach for that door handle. But we didn't stay to find out. We were lucky, and luck, I realized, is a fragile, fleeting thing. In the countryside, lost and desperate, surrounded by darkness, the line between safety and danger is thinner than you could ever imagine. 15 years ago, we went for a drive that I'll never forget, a night that has since carved itself into the deepest parts of my memory. My parents, my younger brother, and I were in the family car, a somewhat battered Nissan Primera. We'd spent the day exploring the countryside, checking out a house far beyond the city limits, a place my parents had considered buying. By the time we wrapped up our little adventure, the sun had long disappeared, leaving behind a cold darkness that made everything feel more unsettling. There was no GPS back then, no comforting blue dot to guide us out of the sprawling countryside and back to civilization. We were, in every sense, completely and utterly lost. Our headlights cut a path through the surrounding blackness, illuminating a world that felt increasingly alien. The road was an endless, winding expanse of dirt, lined with dead trees that loomed like twisted sentinels and tall, wild grass that shivered in the breeze. The atmosphere had taken on an eerie quality, a tension you could almost taste in the air. The car's engine hummed steadily, but even that sound seemed swallowed by the vast, unsettling emptiness. My dad kept a nervous grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. We passed countless deserted crossroads, each one looking more desolate than the last. There was no logic to where we were going. It felt as if we were trapped in some cruel labyrinth. Every time we hoped we were getting closer to the highway, we found ourselves deeper in the maze, surrounded by dark, whispering fields. Then, just as we approached yet another empty intersection, something strange came into view. A shape was lying in the middle of the road, illuminated by our car's high beams. It was a baby carriage, a beat-up, rusted, and overturned baby carriage. My dad slowed down, the tires crunching on the gravel, and my mom's voice sliced through the heavy silence. "Oh my God! Stop! There's a baby!" Her voice trembled with a mix of horror and urgency. As we drew closer, the faintest sound reached us, muffled at first but unmistakable. A baby was crying. The wail was desperate, chilling, the kind of sound that clings to your nerves like icy fingers. My mom's hand went for the door handle, her instincts flaring to life. "My God! The baby! Get the baby!" she screamed, the fear in her voice escalating into a frantic pitch. She started to open her door, her motherly instinct overpowering any logical thought. My dad, however, didn't hesitate. With a sudden, gut-wrenching burst of adrenaline, he slammed the gear into drive and stomped on the gas. The Nissan lurched forward, tires screeching and kicking up gravel. The car fishtailed for a moment, and we all jolted in our seats, but my dad had only one thing on his mind: getting us the hell out of there. My mom screamed in disbelief, her door still half open, and tears streamed down her face. The baby's cries still echoed behind us, though they were now swallowed by the growing distance and the roar of our accelerating engine. My brother and I twisted around in our seats, compelled by the horror and chaos, and that's when we saw them. Figures, 4 of them, erupted from the tall grass lining the road. They moved fast, their shapes distorted in the red glow of our tail lights. Men with wild eyes, their faces obscured by shadows, lunged out of the darkness clutching planks of wood, baseball bats, and makeshift weapons. They looked like hunters who had just missed their prey. My heart stopped as I watched them chase the car for a few steps, weapons raised, before we finally left them behind in the dust. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. My mom was still sobbing, her voice trembling with shock and fear. My dad's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. My brother and I sat frozen, our minds racing to process what had just happened. A beat-up baby carriage, the cries of a phantom infant, and men lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. After what seemed like hours, we finally stumbled onto a highway, the bright headlights of passing cars like beacons guiding us back to the realm of the living. We stopped at the first gas station we saw, the fluorescent lights shining down like a promise of safety. My dad stumbled out of the car, visibly shaken, and approached the attendant. He recounted what had happened, his voice low but tight with residual terror. The gas station attendant barely flinched, as if he'd heard it all before. "Oh yeah," he said with an almost casual nonchalance. "The gypsies. Those guys have been pulling that trick around here for ages. They plant a baby doll in an old carriage, make it cry somehow. People stop, thinking it's a real baby, and then they jump out and rob you blind. Take your car, your money, whatever they can get." My dad stood there, stunned into silence. We'd almost fallen into their trap. Almost. The thought made my skin crawl, the reality that our lives could have taken a much darker turn that night. The idea that shadows were alive with more than just tricks of the light. We never drove back to that area again. The memory of that night, of the overturned baby carriage and those men waiting in the tall grass, has haunted me ever since. Sometimes I think about what could have happened if my dad had hesitated even for a second. If he'd given in to the same instinct that had made my mom reach for that door handle. But we didn't stay to find out. We were lucky, and luck, I realized, is a fragile, fleeting thing. In the countryside, lost and desperate, surrounded by darkness, the line between safety and danger is thinner than you could ever imagine. When you're studying abroad, you expect adventure, a little thrill, and maybe some wild stories to share when you're back home. But nothing could have prepared me for the night my friend and I ventured into the decaying skeleton of a derelict office building on the outskirts of the city. It's a story that's haunted me ever since. It all started when a friend of mine, let's call her Emily, had an idea for a photography project. She was an art major, and her latest obsession was capturing the beauty of urban decay. I had nothing better to do that night, so when she asked me to come along, I agreed, feeling a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The building she had her eye on was infamous, a crumbling structure whispered about in hushed tones by locals. A small, long-abandoned office complex covered in graffiti, with most of the entrances sealed up and the walls layered thick with brick. It had a reputation for being the haunt of junkies and lost souls. We arrived just as twilight began to bleed into darkness. The building loomed ahead of us, an oppressive shadow against the sky, looking more like a mausoleum than an office block. Emily's enthusiasm was contagious, but there was a weight in the air that was hard to shake. We walked toward the building, and the closer we got, the more I noticed the grim details that had gone unnoticed at a distance. The ground was littered with used needles, some still glinting under the dying light, others crusted with dried brown blood. I could feel a chill worm its way into my gut. This place wasn't just abandoned, it had become a graveyard for hope, a shooting gallery for the city's forgotten. Emily stepped over the needles with a grimace, clutching her camera tightly. "Just watch your step," she said, her voice almost too cheerful, like she was trying to fight off the dread. We circled the building, searching for a way in. The windows were all bricked up, as were most of the doors. But then we found it, a gaping, jagged hole punched through one of the brick-laden walls, leading into the stairway. Whoever had torn it open had done so with brute force, ripping apart the barrier like an angry beast. A sudden surge of bravery, or maybe stupidity, overtook us both. Emily's eyes lit up with that artist's spark, and I, not wanting to be the coward in the story, nodded. "Let's just go in for a few shots," she said, her voice hushed. The stairway inside was pitch black, suffocatingly dark, with the faintest hints of must and decay thickening the air. Our footsteps echoed off the stripped concrete, every sound amplified in the oppressive silence. It felt like the building had been picked clean by vultures, everything of value long gone, leaving behind a cold, hollow husk. Emily snapped photos, the flash bursting momentarily to illuminate the gloom, revealing crumbling walls and shadows that seemed to shift when the light faded. We crept upward, one cautious step at a time, aiming for the second floor. Each step felt like a challenge, my heart pounding louder with every creak and groan of the old building. And then we heard it. A sound exploded from above us, a shuffling, scuffling noise that was all wrong. It wasn't just the building settling or debris falling. No, it was deliberate, like someone dragging themselves off the floor. The kind of noise you'd expect if a heavy, slumbering thing had been disturbed and was now waking up. My blood turned to ice. my entire body seized with the kind of fear that turns thought into pure survival. Emily's face went pale, her eyes wide, reflecting my terror. In that frozen moment, I imagined everything: a deranged addict lunging at us, a predator lurking in the dark, something far worse than either of us could comprehend. "Run," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. We didn't need to say it twice. We pivoted, adrenaline propelling us forward. The stairwell seemed to constrict around us, the darkness clawing at our heels. We stumbled through the hole in the wall we'd entered, nearly falling over each other in our panic. The needles, the rotting debris, none of it mattered anymore. We ran, our breaths coming in ragged, panicked gasps, until we reached the car. Emily fumbled with the keys, our hands trembling as she unlocked it. We threw ourselves in, and the engine roared to life. We sped away, the decaying building shrinking into the distance, but the fear still clung to us, thick as oil. We didn't speak for a long while, the car's interior heavy with shared, silent terror. Emily eventually broke the tension, her voice weak and unsteady. "It was probably just some guy. A junkie, right?" We scared each other. I nodded, but deep down I wasn't sure. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made that noise was something worse, something more desperate, something that had made its home in that darkness. Maybe it really was just some lost soul seeking refuge in the dead, empty corridors. But maybe it wasn't. We never went back to that building. Emily eventually finished her project using photos from safer, less haunted places. But I still think about that night. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I replay the sound of that shuffling, of something rising from the shadows. I wonder if it ever remembers us, two terrified intruders who dared to disturb its rest. And I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't run. If we had stayed, frozen on those cold concrete steps, to see what was waiting in the dark. There's something about the woods at dusk that gets under your skin. The way the shadows grow long and the silence thickens, how the trees seem to draw closer, whispering secrets only they understand. I'd been hiking deep in one of those forests, the kind that feels ancient, almost sentient, and I knew it was time to head back. The sun was sinking fast, bleeding crimson through the canopy and staining everything in that eerie, fading light. I stuck to the path, the well-worn trail that promised a way back to safety. I should have kept going, kept my eyes forward, and my mind focused on getting out before darkness swallowed everything. But then I saw it. Something strange, something wrong, hanging from a tree just off the path. My curiosity prickled, even as a voice in the back of my head whispered that I should ignore it, that some things are better left unexplored. I couldn't help myself. I stepped closer, leaves crunching underfoot, and found myself staring at it, a baby doll's head. It dangled from a thin, fraying piece of twine, slowly twisting in the breeze. The face was blank and lifeless, its once blue eyes now a cloudy, unsettling white. Dirt and grime caked the plastic, and the doll's mouth, slightly parted, seemed frozen mid-scream. My heart thumped a little harder, but I told myself it was just some cruel prank. An urban legend brought to life, maybe. But then I glanced up, and my blood turned to ice. There were more. Hundreds of them. Baby doll heads, all hanging from the tree branches. Some were old, their faces cracked and weathered, dirt smudged deep into their features. Others looked horrifyingly new, plastic still gleaming, eyes clear and unclouded. They swung gently above me, whispering plastic on plastic creaks that sounded disturbingly like teeth chattering. My skin prickled, and I felt an instinctive, primal urge to back away. But I couldn't move, rooted to the spot by equal parts horror and disbelief. Who had done this? And why? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Rituals, warnings, or maybe something worse, something not meant for people like me to understand. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Rapid, pounding footsteps, coming closer, fast. Whatever it was heavy, purposeful. The forest had swallowed my voice, my breath, my heartbeat. I didn't dare turn around to see what was approaching. Survival instinct slammed into me like a lightning bolt. I didn't think, I just ran. I tore through the forest, the path blurring beneath me. Branches clawed at my clothes, leaves slapped against my face. The footsteps chased me, echoing through the trees, and I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear is a powerful motivator. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran and ran, as if the forest itself wanted me gone. I finally burst out onto the main trail, my chest heaving, adrenaline still pulsing through my veins. The footsteps had stopped, or maybe they hadn't. I wasn't sure, and I wasn't about to wait and find out. I sprinted all the way back to my car, threw myself inside, and sped out of there, my hands trembling on the wheel. I still don't know who, or what, had been out there. I don't know why someone would hang hundreds of baby doll heads from a tree deep in the forest, each one a grotesque guardian over that haunted patch of woods. But sometimes late at night, I think about those footsteps, about whatever was running through the darkness, so fast and so determined. And I wonder, just for a split second, what would have happened if I hadn't made it out in time. Last summer, my brother and I thought we'd try our hands at a little late-night adventure. We'd been itching to take some photos of the stars, and Central Oregon, with its wide-open skies and eerie, empty back roads, seemed like the perfect place to do it. Out there, away from the noise and light pollution, the stars feel infinite, like you're floating in the middle of a black ocean sprinkled with diamonds. But what seemed like an innocent, spontaneous idea at the time has since become a memory I can't shake. A chilling story I'm not sure I'll ever stop thinking about. We set off around midnight, loaded up with our camera gear, a couple of folding chairs, and a flashlight. The drive itself was uneventful, our car cutting through a thick darkness that seemed to swallow us whole. Tall pines lined the road, casting shadows that twisted and shifted in our headlights. There wasn't a single streetlight for miles, and the silence was so deep it made the rustling leaves sound like whispers. It was the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every noise, every movement. We eventually found a spot that seemed good enough, a flat, gravel pull-off with a clear view of the night sky. We set up our camera on the tripod, pointing it upward at the heavens. My brother fiddled with the settings, adjusting the exposure time, and trying to capture the best shot. We decided on a 20-second exposure, long enough to really soak in the light of the stars, and began experimenting. The air felt cold, even for summer, and I couldn't shake the sense that the forest around us was alive, listening, watching. It's stupid, I know. Your brain plays tricks on you when you're out in the middle of nowhere. Still, I stayed close to the car, shining our flashlight on the road to get a better look at where we were, making sure there weren't any stray animals sneaking up on us. The flashlight beam seemed to barely pierce the darkness, and everything outside its glow quickly faded back into shadow. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the empty road and the endless rows of trees standing like silent sentinels. We stayed there for about 20 minutes, taking pictures, laughing nervously at how creepy the whole setup felt. Every so often, we'd hear a rustle in the bushes, but we'd just brush it off as a deer or maybe the wind playing tricks on us. It never occurred to either of us that something might actually be out there, watching. When we finally packed up and drove home, the adrenaline of being out in the wilderness kept us buzzing with energy. As soon as we got back, we pulled up the photos on my laptop, eager to see if we'd captured the night sky in all its glory. We scrolled through a few pictures, admiring the swirls of stars and the occasional meteor streak, when we stumbled across that shot, the one that made my blood run cold. There, clear as day in the frame, was a figure standing on the road behind us. It was a silhouette, dark and motionless, but distinctly human-shaped. The exposure had captured it standing completely still, arms hanging at its sides, facing directly in our direction. My heart started pounding in my chest, a physical, suffocating thud that made me feel like I couldn't breathe. How had we not noticed it? We'd been standing there for almost 20 minutes. How long had he been watching us? My brother, normally the calm and rational one, went pale. "Dude, no way," he whispered, leaning closer to the screen. We both stared at the image, our brains trying to process what we were seeing. The figure looked too deliberate, too aware. It wasn't like catching a hiker or a jogger in passing. This person, or whatever it was, had been standing perfectly still, observing us. The creepiest part? I had used the flashlight to illuminate the road for a second, so the camera would capture the surrounding area more clearly. I remember sweeping the beam across that very spot and seeing nothing. Nothing but an empty road. Yet the camera, with its 20-second exposure, had captured him, or it, there, lurking in the darkness we had unknowingly shared. I couldn't help but imagine the scene. Me and my brother laughing clueless under that infinite sky. And behind us, the figure standing there, watching, biding its time. Every instinct I had screamed that we'd been in danger, that something had been very, very wrong. What terrified me most, though, was the silence. The figure hadn't made a sound. Not when it moved into the road, not when it disappeared back into the shadows. It had been right there, close enough to see us, close enough to reach us, and we had no idea. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hunter or some lost hiker, but why stand so still? Why in the middle of the road, at night, without making a single noise? Why had it felt like the woods were closing in on us, like we were being swallowed by something we couldn't see. That night, I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure, standing in the dark, just waiting. And whenever I drifted off, I dreamed that I was back on that gravel pull-off, the forest closing in, something creeping closer, the flashlight in my hand flickering uselessly. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, convinced that the shadows in my room were about to spring to life. We haven't gone stargazing since. My brother and I don't talk about that night much, but when we do, there's always that haunted look in his eyes. A silent acknowledgement that we shared a brush with something we still don't understand. Whatever was out there that night in Central Oregon, whether human or something else, I hope it stays lost in the darkness. I hope we never meet again. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone at night, I get the feeling that something is watching me, hidden just out of sight. And I wonder if that figure is still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its world, under that same eerie, star-filled sky. It was a night like any other, or at least that's what I thought. I had left my grandpa's place around 9. The air was cool, with just a hint of humidity that clung to my skin. The sky was a blanket of inky black, and only a thin slice of moon gave any real light. I was headed to my friend's house, a trip I'd made dozens of times before. The fastest way there was to cut through a nearby trailer park surrounded by thick woods. It wasn't the kind of place that inspired confidence after dark, but if you knew the right route, you could save 10 minutes by sneaking through someone's backyard and onto a narrow dirt path that sliced through the trees. It was a shortcut born out of teenage impatience, and even though it felt sketchy, I always convinced myself it was worth it. The trailer park itself was quiet. A few porch lights glowed, casting weak circles of yellow that barely pushed back the darkness. I slipped between two mobile homes, feeling the odd thrill of trespassing, and emerged in the family's yard I always crossed. My sneakers crunched softly on the grass, and I could hear the faint hum of an air conditioning unit working overtime, battling the lingering summer heat. I kept my head low, moving quickly but cautiously. And then, I reached the woods. That's when everything changed. I stepped to the edge of the tree line, and that's when I saw them, 3 orbs of light, just hanging there in the air. They were about the size of softballs, glowing a cold bluish white. They hovered maybe 6 feet off the ground, perfectly still. My heart lurched in my chest, and I came to a dead stop. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The orbs didn't flicker like flashlights or lanterns. They were solid, each one casting a faint, otherworldly glow that barely illuminated the trees around them. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, but as I stood there, nothing about the scene made any sense. No one popped out from behind a tree. No laughter broke the heavy silence. The orbs just floated, as if they were observing me. I squinted, tilting my head and taking a step forward. My mind grasped for explanations. Fireflies? No, they were too large and too steady. Some kind of weird optical illusion? But what kind of illusion would hang in midair, defying gravity? My breath came shallow, and my hands felt clammy. I don't believe in ghosts, spirits, or any of that supernatural stuff, but this made me question everything I thought I knew. The longer I stared, the more I felt like the orbs were staring back, almost as if they had some kind of awareness. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, the rush of blood making everything else feel eerily muted. I took a cautious step forward, half expecting the lights to react, and they did. They shifted slightly, almost like they were assessing me, and I swear, for the briefest moment, the shadows around the orbs seemed to bend. That's when I realized that the night had gone unnaturally silent. The usual chorus of crickets and distant dog barks had faded, leaving only the sound of my own breath in the void. The woods felt suffocating, like something unseen was holding its breath along with me. I decided to test my luck. I swallowed, steeling myself, and stepped even closer. My feet were heavy, each movement deliberate. As I closed the gap, the orbs began to drift back, as if leading me deeper into the woods. The way they moved sent a chill crawling up my spine. They didn't just float randomly. There was a deliberate grace to it, an unsettling fluidity that made them seem alive. Okay, this is getting weird, I whispered to myself, my voice cracking. I forced a laugh, but the sound came out shaky and hollow. Was I really about to follow these lights? What kind of horror movie logic was that? Yet, against all sense, curiosity pulled me forward. I inched closer, my body on high alert, every nerve tingling. Then, without warning, the orbs darted backward, moving faster than I thought possible. They didn't flicker or waver. They just glided away, deeper into the dark woods. It was so sudden, so deliberate, that the hairs on my neck stood on end. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and for a moment, all I could think was run. But I stood frozen, torn between chasing after them or bolting in the opposite direction. A cold wind rushed through the trees, rustling the leaves, and the spell was broken. I chose the safer option, flight. I turned on my heel and sprinted, my feet slamming against the dirt path as I tore through the trees, back into the trailer park. My legs felt like lead, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The whole way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, just out of sight, ready to reach out and grab me. I burst out of the woods, back into the relative safety of the trailer park, my chest heaving, and didn't stop running until I was out on the main road, streetlights blazing down like a welcome sign. Only then did I finally slow down, bent over, gasping for breath, my heart still hammering in my chest. When I finally made it to my friend's house, I didn't tell him much. Just that I'd taken the long way, that the woods were creepier than usual. I didn't want to sound crazy, didn't want to admit how shaken I was by those strange, hovering lights. But the memory of them stayed with me, the cold glow burned into my mind. To this day, I have no logical explanation for what I saw that night. No matter how many times I think back on it, I can't come up with a satisfying answer. Just the image of those orbs, hanging there in the dark, watching me as if they were waiting for something. Or someone. There are some memories that stick with you no matter how much time passes. Even now, 20 years later, I can't shake the vivid recollection of that day deep in the woods of northern Ontario. It's a story that still raises the hair on the back of my neck, a chilling moment I never saw coming. My family's house wasn't just in the countryside, it was practically swallowed by the wilderness. My grandpa had built it himself, clearing the land from an ancient forest that had stood for generations. Before he set his sights on the place, there was nothing but miles and miles of dense trees, the kind that closed in around you like a living wall, blocking out the sky and sound. We were isolated, with no neighbors for miles and no connection to the outside world beyond a winding dirt road that took half an hour to drive. It was a place where the forest felt alive, breathing, watching. I was about 8 years old, the kind of kid who loved exploring, even if it sometimes led me to places I shouldn't have gone. The forest was my playground, a vast, mysterious world full of adventure. My grandpa had always warned me to be careful, to stay within earshot of the house, but on that day, curiosity got the better of me. It was early afternoon, the sunlight filtering through the thick canopy in golden patches. The forest smelled like wet earth and pine, a familiar and comforting scent. I'd been wandering for a while, following a game trail that twisted through the underbrush, when I stumbled upon something that made me stop in my tracks. There, in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, was a well. It looked impossibly old, a perfect circle of moss-covered stones that had sunken unevenly into the dirt. Vines crept around the edges, wrapping themselves like bony fingers over the lip. The wooden frame that once held a pulley system had long since rotted away, leaving jagged, splintered beams that jutted toward the sky. It didn't belong there, not in this untouched part of the forest. My grandpa had cleared all the land around our house himself, cutting down trees that were centuries old. No one else had lived here, not for generations. I stepped closer, my heartbeat picking up. The well exuded a sense of ancientness, a feeling that it had witnessed things no one could understand. I peered over the edge, but the light barely made it halfway down. It was dark, impossibly deep, and I couldn't see the bottom. A gust of cold, damp air wafted up, carrying a musty metallic scent that made me wrinkle my nose. "Hello!" I called, half-jokingly, my voice echoing back in a way that felt strangely distorted. I remember laughing nervously, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling crawling up my spine. But the forest had gone unnervingly quiet. The usual sounds, chirping birds, rustling leaves, the occasional squirrel chattering, had vanished. It was like the entire world was holding its breath. I leaned in a bit closer, squinting into the shadows. My foot scuffed a loose stone, and it tumbled into the well, clattering down the sides before disappearing into the void. I counted the seconds, waiting for the sound of it hitting the bottom, but it never came. The stone just vanished, swallowed up by the darkness. That's when I heard it, a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, eyes wide. It sounded like someone's voice, soft and thin, rising from the depths of the well. I strained to listen, my heart thudding in my chest. Was my mind playing tricks on me? My skin prickled, and I felt a tightness in my stomach. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to run. Fear held me in place, rooting me to the ground. I listened for the voice again, but nothing. Then I heard a sound of water splashing at the bottom of the well. I took one step back, turned and ran, sprinting through the forest with a speed I didn't know I was capable of. Branches whipped at my face and arms, and I nearly tripped several times, but I didn't dare stop. The feeling of being watched, of something following just behind me, was suffocating. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing something chasing me, something crawling up from that ancient well, was too much to bear. When I finally burst out of the woods and into the clearing where our house sat, I was gasping for breath. My grandpa was outside, working on the porch. He saw me, took one look at my face, and knew something was wrong. He didn't say anything, just put down his tools and walked over, his expression serious. I didn't tell him everything. How could I? How do you explain something like that? I just mumbled something about getting lost, and he nodded, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the woods. That night, as the sun set and darkness crept over our little island of civilization, I heard my grandpa lock all the doors and windows, something he almost never did. He stayed up late, sitting by the fireplace with his old hunting rifle across his lap. Years later, I asked him about it, about the woods and the well I'd found. His face darkened, and he told me in a quiet voice that the land was old, far older than we could understand, and that some things are best left alone. He never elaborated, and I never pressed him. But sometimes, when I think about that day, I can still hear that whisper, soft and insidious, echoing up from the darkness. It was the summer before college, and I had a habit of going on long hikes to clear my head. I grew up near a sprawling national forest, with miles of trails that wound through dense woods, alongside rivers, and over rocky outcrops that offered breathtaking views of the valley below. Hiking was my escape, my way of sorting through the chaos of growing up and everything that came with it. But one night changed the way I saw those trails forever. I'd made a questionable decision that evening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, while I was still a good few miles from the trailhead where my car was parked. The twilight painted the forest in muted blues and grays, and the shadows grew longer, stretching across the path. I pulled out my flashlight and continued, the beam cutting through the darkness, though it did little to shake the growing sense of unease creeping over me. I'd been on this trail 100 times, but it felt different at night, like the woods had secrets I was never meant to uncover. My footsteps crunched on the dirt and fallen leaves, echoing too loudly in the stillness. The forest had gone quiet, eerily so. No rustle of animals in the underbrush, no distant calls of birds. Just my own breaths and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I tried to shake the feeling that something was watching me, telling myself it was just the dark playing tricks on my mind. Still, my grip on the flashlight tightened, and I quickened my pace, desperate to get back to the safety of my car. Then, out of nowhere, my foot came down on something soft and yielding, something that definitely shouldn't have been in the middle of the trail. My heart stopped, and for a split second, I thought I was about to be swallowed whole by the darkness around me. I stumbled, the flashlight swinging wildly as I struggled to keep my balance. I froze, too terrified to look down, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. It could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. Something that had wandered onto the trail and collapsed. But deep down, I knew it didn't feel like that. The shape was too human, too solid. The kind of sensation that doesn't leave your foot even after you lift it off. I shone the flashlight around, trying to keep the beam steady, but the woods seemed to close in tighter, suffocating me with their silence. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. There was something else out there, something I couldn't see but could almost feel. The sense of being watched was so intense it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just in my head. Someone, or something, was out there in the darkness. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just my overactive imagination. Just the forest at night. But then I heard it. The faintest rustle of leaves, the whisper of movement, like someone shifting in the underbrush. It wasn't the sound of an animal, but something deliberate, careful. It came from just off the trail, maybe 20 feet away, and I realized with mounting terror that whatever, or whoever, was out there was trying not to be seen. Trying not to be heard. Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't care about the noise I was making, or the way branches clawed at my arms as I pushed through the underbrush. I just knew I had to get away. My flashlight bounced wildly, casting distorted shadows that only heightened my fear. The path felt endless, twisting and turning, and I kept expecting something, or someone, to grab me from behind. Somehow, I made it back to the trailhead, lungs burning and legs trembling. I practically threw myself into my car, locking the doors and fumbling to start the engine. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. Finally, the car roared to life, and I sped away, not daring to look back in the rearview mirror. The sense of dread followed me all the way home, lingering long after I'd locked every door and window in the house. For days, I tried to convince myself it had just been a weird experience. Maybe I'd stepped on a pile of leaves, or maybe a dead animal. But the thought wouldn't leave me. It gnawed at me, a memory that refused to fade. A few weeks later, I came across a story that made my blood run cold. An interview with Ted Bundy, the infamous serial killer. When asked about the closest he ever came to being caught, Bundy had shared something bone-chilling. He described a time when he was dragging a body across a hiking trail and heard someone approaching. He had to leave the body and hide in the bushes as the person walked by. The terrifying detail? The person had stepped on the body and didn't even realize what they'd done. Reading that, I felt like I was back on that trail, standing over whatever I'd stepped on, the darkness pressing in. My mind raced, replaying every second of that night. The strange feeling under my foot, the whisper of movement in the woods, the overwhelming sense of being watched. Had I stepped on? No, I couldn't let myself believe it. But the possibility clawed at me, refusing to let go. I haven't gone hiking at night since. This is the story of when I came across human flesh on a hike. It was late autumn, and the forest felt empty, like it had exhaled its last breath of life and was waiting for winter to come and finish the job. The trees were mostly bare, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Dry leaves crunched underfoot, and the wind whispered secrets that no one was meant to hear. I had been hiking alone, which, looking back, was a terrible idea. But I loved the solitude of the woods, the feeling that you were the only person in a world that felt vast and endless. I had wandered about 20 minutes off the trail, just exploring. The deeper I went, the quieter it got, like I was stepping into another dimension where even the birds didn't dare sing. The air had a heavy, almost expectant quality, like the forest was waiting for something to happen. I shrugged off the creeping unease and kept moving, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under low-hanging branches. Then I saw it. At first, it didn't register. It was just a small, very pink slab of something, lying in the dirt among the dried leaves. It seemed out of place, almost cartoonish against the drab colors of the forest. I frowned, stepping closer, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, decaying earth. The thing was small, about the size of my palm, and the more I looked at it, the more wrong it seemed. It was a piece of meat, torn and ragged, the edges darkened like it had been yanked or chewed. My curiosity got the better of me, and I bent down to get a closer look. The air felt colder, pressing in on me like icy hands. I reached out and gingerly picked it up, the weight of it unsettling. It was slimy and still disturbingly fresh, and that's when the realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was a human tongue. I dropped it immediately, stumbling backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. The tongue lay there in the dirt, grotesque and lifeless, the taste buds visible, the base frayed and torn. My stomach twisted, and I nearly doubled over. A million thoughts raced through my mind. How did it get here? Who did it belong to? And most horrifyingly, where was the rest of the person? I stood there frozen, every instinct screaming at me to get the hell out. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and groan, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard something else, a whisper, low and wet, almost like a gurgle. My head snapped around, eyes scanning the forest, but I saw nothing. Just endless trees, and the encroaching shadows as the sun slipped lower in the sky. I took a shaky step back, then another, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt crowded, like there were eyes hidden among the trees, watching. I didn't want to turn my back, but I had to get out of there. Slowly, I started making my way back the way I came, keeping my eyes on the clearing where the tongue lay, as if expecting something to crawl out of the shadows and claim it. But then, the forest betrayed me. My boot snagged on a root, and I stumbled, the noise echoing far too loudly. As I regained my balance, I heard it, footsteps. They were faint at first, almost blending in with the rustling leaves, but they were there. Someone, or something, was moving through the woods, coming closer. The sound was heavy, deliberate, like it knew exactly where I was. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. Panic erupted in my chest, and I ran. I didn't care about being quiet. All I cared about was getting out, away from whatever was out there. The forest became a blur of gray and brown, branches snagging at my jacket and tearing at my skin. The The footsteps followed, gaining on me, and I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. I crashed back onto the main trail, lungs burning, and kept running, not daring to look back until I was almost at the parking lot. Only then did I risk a glance over my shoulder. The woods were still, empty, no sign of movement, but I knew better than to feel relieved. I had felt it out there, something watching, something lurking. I jumped into my car, locking the doors and peeling out of there without a second thought. The drive home was a blur, and even when I finally got to the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like something had followed me back. I didn't go hiking for weeks after that. When I finally did return, I stuck to well-worn trails and always went with friends. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, I heard a news report about a missing person. A hiker had vanished without a trace in the very same woods. They never found a body, just some belongings scattered deep in the forest. The news anchor mentioned a possible animal attack, but I knew it wasn't that. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night, I think about that tongue, about how fresh it was. I wonder who it belonged to, and if they were still alive when it was torn out. But most of all, I wonder what was out there that day, hiding in the trees, dragging something heavy and breathing wet whispers into the cold autumn air.